Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here today with Ed Rock, the Martin Lipton Professor of Law at NYU, to discuss his paper, The Emergence of Welfarist Corporate Governance. And he's written this with Marcel Kahan, the George T. Lowy Professor of Law, also at NYU. So Ed, thanks very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And when I saw this paper come through, the working paper series, it immediately caught my eye because it discusses the very topical issue of the tension between shareholders and other stakeholders, but I think in a much richer way than much of the current discussion about ESG. So I'm really looking forward to discussing this. So let's just start with what motivated you to write the paper.
So Marcel and I have been working on a related set of issues over the last few years. It in some respects started with our work on the American Law Institute's restatement of corporate governance, when we had to grapple with the question of what is the, quote, objective of a corporation. Out of that, I wrote a paper called For Whom is the Corporation Managed in 2020 that tried to make sense of this debate that is so prominent both in the US and in the UK and now around the world over for whom is the corporation managed, which raises a bunch of these issues about stakeholders versus shareholders, about the role of ESG considerations, about the duties that are owed to society by for-profit corporations, especially the largest public businesses. That led us to write a paper that looked really closely at what has become quite an interesting and I think growing movement known as systemic stewardship. And systemic stewardship starts with the idea that the largest investors are universal owners, or at least universal managers, that they hold a portfolio that essentially covers the whole public market and often some portion of the private market. And a number of people in the nonprofit sector, Rick Alexander at Shareholder Commons, in the academic sector, Madison Condit at BU and Jeff Gordon at Columbia, have argued that it is rational and optimal for universal owners and managers to manage not on an individual firm basis, not trying to maximize the value of individual firms, but instead to manage on a portfolio basis, and in doing so, to manage with an eye towards systemic risk.
What's interesting about it is that that universal owner argument sort of starts off as a value maximization argument financially, but at the portfolio level. But as you observe in your paper, it actually extends quite often into concepts of social welfare that go beyond purely financial maximization at the portfolio level. And you talk about the three kind of flavors of portfolio welfarism, shareholder welfarism, and direct social welfarism. Yeah, how do these differ, and how do you see this spectrum operating?
So they're fascinating because they divide up the world in a different way than the shareholder stakeholder debate, than the ESG debate. It's just a different way of conceptualizing it that I think actually tells us a lot about the different positions. So you're absolutely right that this universal owner, universal manager approach, strategy, shares a lot with the traditional view, because ultimately what they're concerned about is shareholder value. But they say, we're a universal owner. The only rational thing for us to do is to be concerned with the overall value of the portfolio that needs to pay out the pension benefits over the next 50 years and so forth. It's an entirely, I think, rational approach. So where does it break from the traditional view? It breaks it at the unit of analysis. It doesn't ask as to individual firms, what's the profit maximizing strategy? It says as to the portfolio as a whole. And the proponents of it, like Rick Alexander, say, look, this is my words, but I think he would agree with this, is that to a first approximation, a universal owner has incentives that are much better aligned with overall social welfare than any individual firm. Now, it's not perfect. Obviously, it doesn't cover some of the private companies. It doesn't cover some of the interests of people who aren't invested in pension funds and so forth. So it's not, there's no suggestion that it's a perfect alignment with social welfare. But the point Rick makes, and I think he's correct, is on the face of it, it seems to be a better alignment than the traditional injunction of maximize single firm value. And that's how the welfare aspect comes in. It shares with the traditional old-time religion the concern with shareholder value. But by shifting the level at which he's maximizing shareholder value from the individual firm level to the portfolio level, he's making a very interesting move that, on his argument, is better facilitates social welfare. The second sort, which we refer to as shareholder welfarism, I associate really with some interesting articles by Colin Mayer, not by Colin Mayer, by Oliver Hart and Luigi. And Luigi and Oliver start with the notion, which I think is they start from a shareholderist view. They say, look, the purpose of corporations is to benefit their shareholders. But they say, interestingly, shareholders have interests that go beyond just how much money they have in their pocket. They care about the environment. Indeed, as we know, and as they point out, shareholders as individuals are often willing to spend more for sustainable goods. And they say, and this is the core move in their piece, and they say if they're willing to do that in their personal life, why in the world wouldn't they want their companies to do that? Now, it's a very seductive move because on the face of it, it seems to be very much within the shareholders framework. You don't need to start talking about stakeholders and so forth in order to endorse that. But in fact, it's a fundamental departure from the traditional view. And it's a fundamental departure because the traditional view doesn't say that the duty of fiduciaries is to maximize shareholder value. What it says is the duty of fiduciaries is to the corporation to promote the value of the corporation for the benefit of the shareholder. Now, those are really different. Now, why the confusion? As a rule of thumb, maximize share price, as a rule of thumb in a reasonably competitive market, is a pretty good proxy for maximized firm value. Right? And most of the time, you're not going to go wrong with that.
Yeah.
But the shift from maximizing share value to maximizing shareholder welfare is a fundamental departure because there's no economic model where shareholder welfare is a proxy for firm value.
Yeah.
So in fact, you're bringing in a whole other set of concerns, and those concerns, there are a bunch of problems one has with those concerns, but I think our main intervention there is that approach underestimates the tension between that approach and the traditional approach, which is promote the value of the firm. The third approach, which is Colin Mayer's approach, says, look, the legislatures aren't doing what we need them to do. And we actually can't rely on even universal owners to ensure that corporations are making society a better place, are providing solutions to people and planet and not causing harm. We can't depend on that because they have the wrong incentives. And so what we need to do, and this I think is a fascinating move that Colin makes and that the British Academy Project makes, what we need to do is to change the welfare function of the corporation to constrain the corporation's welfare function to socially productive activities. Now, that raises a whole set of issues that, for instance, Paul Davies, our ECGI colleague, has explored in depth, which is, how do you do that? How does the law do that?
How do you define them?
There's a history to that goes under the heading of the ultra-virus doctrine that shows just how difficult it is for the law to do that. But that's the input there. And they're not depending on the legislature. and not depending on the financial interests of the universal owners. Kahan says we've got to do it directly. And I think, as the rest of my discussion suggests, I genuinely share his concerns with the fact that the legislatures, the regulators are not controlling climate change. And I'm skeptical about the ability of the universal owners to step in. So on those basic facts that make me concerned, I share Kahan's concern. Where ultimately Marcel and I think, differ with Kahan is the solution that he proposes. But for this paper, but that's a separate issue. For this paper, it's an important flavor of this welfarism, because it's an attempt to directly align the activities of the firm with social welfare.
And you highlight a couple of particular forces that you think will act to limit this spread of welfarist corporate governance, and that's the existence of private companies and the lack of political support. How will you see those forces coming into play?
So the focus here, all three versions inevitably focus on public companies, because public companies are in the spotlight. Private companies, especially in the US, but also around the world, are subject to much lighter kind of regulation and intervention and oversight. And the more obligations that are inconsistent with maximizing firm value or maximizing shareholder value in the firm, the more obligations we place on public companies, the more attractive it is to stay private or to go private. Is this a first order effect? I doubt it, because I don't think the obligations to date have been that severe. But in principle, and I think in practice, the private market acts as a very important check on any non-value maximizing obligations that we impose on public companies. So I think, to start with, there's the threat of the private market. The second problem is, of course, the way companies are set up, which is with massive amounts of equity or equity-linked instruments given to managers to align managers' interest with the financial interests of their shareholders. And one can imagine shifting to some other approach, which is, for instance, to align the interest not with share value, but with something else. But we're not there, and shareholders will push back against that. That's not what shareholders want. So I think the status quo bias is huge. Yeah. And the final thing is quite fascinating, which is, in the time that we have worked on this paper, we have seen the growth and emergence of this political backlash against this sort of approach. And it goes under the headings of anti-woke capitalism or anti-ESG and so forth. But what it really is an attack on these approaches to corporate law and corporate governance that are trying to align or push corporations to solve social problems. And that backlash has gotten quite severe. Vivek Ramaswamy, who wrote Woke Capitalism and started Strive, is now running for president on an anti-woke capitalism platform. And what Vivek is arguing, essentially, there's a lot of other stuff going on as he tries to move into the political domain. But what Vivek is really arguing for is the traditional view of corporations and corporate governance, which is a view that corporations and that corporate governance is about keeping corporations in their own lane. Align it so that they promote the value of their firm, but leave things like climate change to the political branch. The pushback has something to it.
I mean, it's certainly the case, isn't it, that when people advocate for corporates taking a stronger position on environmental and social objectives, they certainly have in mind that it's their own environmental and social objectives that are going to be reflected in the corporation's stance, and we always have to put ourselves in the situation of the boot being on the other foot. So it sounds like you don't see this as representing a fundamental move away from the idea that corporations should be creating long-term value for shareholders, because actually there are powerful countervailing forces. But you are observing a change in the extent to which these welfarist considerations are coming into play. So is this more just an evolution of the societal constraints subject to which value is pursued? Because, I mean, for example, you mentioned Milton Friedman. He himself said that companies should conform to the basic rules of society, which include those embodied in ethical customs. So is what we're just seeing here an evolution in what is meant by that ethical custom, or is it more than that that's going on with this?
I think we have to wait and see. So what are the forces that's moving dramatically in this direction? Well, some argue that millennials have a different approach to investment than older generations. And if that's right, as millennials both get richer and more prominent in running corporations and in investing in corporations, it's possible that that shareholder pressure will move in this direction. Mm-hmm. I think it's too early to tell. So I'm personally skeptical about it being anything more than evolutionary, but it's the future. So we'll have to wait and see. There are these forces that may move in that direction, in particular, the notion of changing shareholder preferences. Because after all, what we're seeing today in terms of the corporate stewardship groups at the universal owners pushing companies in a direction that is more sustainable, what we're seeing today is some combination between traditional corporate governance, which says, look, you know, if you're a property and casualty insurance company writing policies in Florida, you better be paying attention to climate change because it affects your basic business model. That's fine. There's nothing controversial about that. There shouldn't be anything controversial about that. That's all about figuring out an optimal strategy for a given firm. Yeah. And a lot of what the stewardship groups do, I think, is in that category of value rather than values. Yeah. But undoubtedly, there's been some over the last 5 years that has said, separate and apart from that, we have a view that we're going through a transition from carbon-based energy to non-carbon-based energy, to renewable energy. That's our view of the future. Mm-hmm. And you corporations better show us how you're getting there. Mm. Now that's a departure because they may be wrong.
But even more than that, it's not just a view of the future; it's a normative view of the future, isn't it? It's you know, which is a big...
And but what that's reflecting, what's so interesting to me in the context of this paper is what that's reflecting is the views of the current folks who are running these stewardship groups and who are running asset management firms. And if millennials turn out to have a fundamentally different view about the corporation's role in society, about shareholders' role in the corporation, about the future, and about how we should get there, that's a channel through which change could come. So it's the future. Who knows?
Who knows?
Who knows what's going to happen? And I also am of the view that some of this shareholder-driven climate activism has a chance to change the politics.
I was going to ask you about that, because there is this argument that all of this sort of voluntarist shareholder corporate action on these welfarist issues is actually a dangerous placebo, in Tarek Fancy's words, that undermines, the necessary change that we need to get in the legislature. But actually, you argue against that. You say that actually, if anything, this probably makes it more likely that we get the necessary change through the political process. Why do you say that?
So, I think it's an open question, and I don't have any good data certainly to support my view, but I'm an optimist at heart. So I'm hopeful. But here's the way I think about it. There are two pieces to it, and it sort of comes back to the question that a lot of people have when you see billionaires recycling their water bottles. Now, on the one hand, you can say, it's the height of hypocrisy when somebody flies in on their private jet and then recycles their water bottles. And I'm very sympathetic to that view. It I think is part of the amusing. It's an amusing spectacle to see that. On the other hand, it shows a degree of perhaps consciousness about the problems of sustainability that can translate into other spheres, and it can translate, it seems to me, in two ways. One is if those folks, and that's, there's a stand-in for the financial and political elites who actually make decisions. If those folks, through their children leaning on them to recycle their water bottles, if those folks actually come to the view that climate change is an existential threat, then we're much closer to adopting regulation. And how do people get to that view? And I think it's complicated how people change their views. And I think data has only a limited role in people actually changing their views. Yeah. But things like pressure from shareholders to take the social cost of climate into account in capital budgeting decisions, that those sorts of things, if seriously discussed in the boardroom, are a way of changing what you might think of as the ideology of the boardroom. So it's a sort of almost Leninist view of ideology, that it's this is the vanguard that needs to now be re-educated to then lead the rest of society. So that's one channel. A second channel is much more self-interested, which is shareholder pressure has put a lot of pressure on Shell Oil, on Exxon, to take the social cost of carbon into account in their budgeting decisions. That puts them at a competitive disadvantage with less prominent oil and gas companies. And if you think about just the standard kind of public choice model of politics, you say, if you're Exxon, if you're Chevron, and you have these restrictions on your freedom of action because of shareholder pressure, that puts you at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the independents. You'd like to do something about that. Well, what can you do about it? Well, legislation on imposing a carbon tax on everybody is going to put you on equal footing with them, or to put it differently, to impose some of the same limitations you have on them. So that the idea there is that the shareholder-driven climate activism could change the self-interest, the political interest of the majors. And there's some evidence that it has, which is, I find, incredibly intriguing. So, for instance, the American Petroleum Institute a couple of years ago endorsed a carbon tax. The Business Roundtable has endorsed a carbon tax. Maybe it's because they've seen the light, or maybe it's because they figure that if they have to suffer under these restrictions, everybody else should too.
That's interesting. So in the end, Ed, I read your paper as suggesting that the welfarist trend probably isn't going to be strong enough to remake the whole way that capitalism works. There are, too many forces that act against that. But it could be strong enough to create the circumstances in which more welfarist regulation is introduced. And that just means that the system will operate, but within different guardrails. Is that fair, or do you see some more fundamental changes to how corporations are governed that could arise from all of this?
So I don't know. I think that's fair. And I think that's the hopeful version of it, which is, look, again, take climate change. It's not going to be solved without legislation. It's just not, and we know more or less what a strategy to get to control is, which is a carbon tax combined with transfer payments, so that the poorest among us don't end up bearing a disproportionate cost of controlling carbon. We know that. And when you compare that strategy to any of these welfarist strategies, that strategy dominates across every dimension, except we don't have it. And how are we going to get there? I actually view all three strategies as ultimately thinking that this will help us get there. That as we make it clear that the only justification for for-profit corporations now and in the past has been that having the institution of the corporation, having the enterprise form of the corporation, which has been this incredible device for the generation of wealth since the 19th century, that the justification for that ultimately has to be in terms of overall social welfare. That's the justification of law. The question is how you get there.
Yeah.
And maybe the traditional way is currently, seems among these folks, traditionally, they don't trust the traditional way, and I understand why they don't. It may be that the welfarist turn ultimately helps us get to the position where we end up with regulation that does a decent job controlling externalities.
Yeah. Ed, that's been a really stimulating discussion. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you.